Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our distinguished guest today is Victor Davis Hanson, who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. His most recent book is A War Like No Other: How the Athenians and Spartans Fought the Peloponnesian War. His column appears regularly in the National Review, and he writes opinion pieces regularly in the Washington Post. He is on the Berkeley campus this spring as the 22nd Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz Lecturer. Joining us in the studio is Thomas G. Barnes, who is Professor of History and Law and Emeritus, Professor of History and Law Emeritus at the University of California at Berkeley. Victor, Tom, welcome to our program. Why did you write this book, which I will now show to our audience, A War Like No Other?
I wanted to explain the Peloponnesian War from the viewpoint of the people who fought it, rather than the fine accounts that we have about the strategy, politics, and political, tactical ramifications. More or less, what was it like to be in a trireme, what it was like to be on a horse, what was it like to be in a phalanx, and how did the men's experience teach us something about that war.
Remind us what the war was about and who were the main antagonists.
Well, it was 27 and a half years long, the Peloponnesian War, and it started in May of 431 when Sparta preempted and crossed the border into Attica, which was the countryside of Athens. And they said they did so because of various perceived grievances on the part of Athens had encroached on their territory. But it was a judgment of the historian Thucydides. They did it for fear, generic fear. They wanted to stop this juggernaut before it took over the Greek world. And because Sparta was oligarchic, Athens was democratic, Sparta was a land power, Athens was a sea power, Sparta was parochial, Athens cosmopolitan. They had these fault lines that were not to be bridged. And 27 and a half years later, the war was over. And the fascinating thing about this was, to win the war, Athens has to build an army to defeat the Spartan army, or Sparta has to build a fleet to beat the Athenian fleet. And you'd think that the conniving, quick-witted Athenians would have figured that out first, and that's not what happened. Sparta built a fleet, defeated the Athenian fleet, broke up its maritime empire, bankrupted its treasury, cut off its food, and won the war.
Mm-hmm. Did both sides start the war with a strategy which they kept to, or did their strategy evolve over time? Their
strategies evolved. Sparta started the war with a very outdated strategy that had worked in small bordered wars with among its own allies. Basically, I will cross into someone else's territory and I will attack their agriculture, and that'll make them so mad that they will come out and fight. But if you, in the case of Athens, if you have imported food, then you don't really care what happens to the agriculture around you. So the Athenians went into the walls. And by the same token, the Athenian strategy under Pericles was simply, we will go into the walls, we will import food, we'll keep our empire and its tribute intact, we will circle the Peloponnese and harass the Spartans, and we can weather a war of attrition rather than annihilation longer, and we will not win, but because we don't lose, the status before the war favored us, so all we have to do is tie. I think you and I know, Thomas, that you don't ever win a war when you think you're going to tie. Mm-hmm. So that was tragedy at Athens.
You write, everything considered, wisdom at the beginning of the war would be proven folly at its end. Any comments on that statement?
Well, the Spartans thought it was wise to, as I said, devastate agriculture. That didn't work. The Athenians thought it was wise to go inside the walls, and a city designed for 100,000 people quickly was decimated by a terrible plague. Maybe it was smallpox, maybe it was typhoid, but they lost somewhere around 80,000 of their own. And the idea that Sparta could ever build a fleet was considered preposterous, but they turned out to be quite adept at it with Persian money. Nobody ever thought you'd go all the way to Sicily and open up another front in the middle of this war like Athens did. And everybody thought the war would be decided by hoplites, that's heavy infantrymen. In fact, there were only 2 battles. So terror, horsemen, ships, all of these non-conventional ways of encountering enemy forces turned out to be the preferred method of battle.
A lot of histories have been written, and interestingly enough, as a historian, I'm curious why you chose to do these chapters that you did. Your book is not really a chronology, although the chronology is embedded, but you've taken thematic themes and terror and so on. Talk a little about that, just as your work as a historian.
I quickly discovered that I had 2 mutually inconsistent goals. One was to tell the war in chronological order from 431 to its conclusion in 404, and the other was to talk about theaters of experience. So I would have something on fighting in the fields, fighting on ships, fighting on horses, fighting in armor, the use of, as I said, terror, sieges. But the problem was that each of those didn't sequentially follow one another. We didn't just hop from one theater. So I found myself very quickly having to, that was a good word to use, embed the chronology and privilege the experience of war and hope that I could still carry the tale while I was describing a particular method of combat. Because that was a primary goal, to explain to people why the Peloponnesian War was considered so paramount to later generations in the West. It wasn't because Sparta won necessarily, because they really didn't do much with their victory, and they were friends with Athens within 15 years. But what had happened was that it changed the mentality of Greeks. It was considered barbaric, and to find those answers, I had to actually look at what happened.
And I think you're saying somewhere in the book that in the end, the Peloponnesian Wars really changed what war was about, really.
Yes.
In the end, it wasn't what it had been at the beginning.
Yes. Greek warfare had ethical constraints that it was, I guess the word that sociologists use is constructed. That is, that people don't always employ the methodology or the technology that they otherwise would be capable of because of protocol. So you cross somebody else's border, you allow single males or married males or adult males, however you define them, to get armor on and attack each other. But you don't use the Greek genius that creates the Parthenon sculptures or can measure the diameter of the sun. You don't use that technology for things that otherwise might prove very efficient in war, such as catapults, or such as siegecraft, or such as hiring mercenary soldiers, or freeing slaves. But as this war wore on year after year, the protocols were shed, and the Greek genius was applied to war making without ethical restraint.
I know you're a commentator on contemporary events, drawing on this classical history that is your other professional work, and we're going to talk about that in one second. But before we segue into that, I want to paraphrase something that you said at the dinner last night, the Nimitz letter, and I think what I jotted down was, human nature is constant, tragedy endures, lessons are to be learned through empiricism. Talk a little about that, because that's a segue into the present.
Well, the reason that we can study with value, and that's a key word, with profit, in a didactic fashion. Thucydides, the chronicler, for example, the Peloponnesian War, is the one requisite. Human nature doesn't change, so that the humans in that book, or the humans in the 7 Years' War, the humans in the Civil War, are all basically hardwired the same way. They have the same emotions. They're subject to envy, pride, and the Peloponnesian War, with the necessary changes being made, that is technology, can tell us exactly why states go to war, how they feel, balance of power, deterrence that we see in the present. If you don't believe that, you would have to believe that just in the 2,500 years of Western civilization, we've had an accelerated Darwinian evolution of the human mind, or maybe using computer games or using a computer has changed our circuitry, and made us into people who are not subject to those. Or maybe, as the therapists believe, we're so affluent or so educated now that we don't have to go back and worry about those primordial emotions. But it's my view that Thucydides was right, that human nature hadn't changed and will not change, and therefore each war is instructive about other wars to come.
Now, I know you were recently in Iraq, so Tom, would you like to start off and ask some questions about their war in Iraq?
I would very much like to. I'd had the chance earlier, of course, today, Victor, to talk to you a little bit about, when you were in Kevin Adams' class, the way the war is going and your view of the dynamics of it.
Well, I was there in February, and I'll be back, I think, on March 6th for a longer stay. I think what's interesting about this war, if I could use that word, interesting about something that's so bloody, is it's changing all the time and evolving. So the war in 2006 is not what was 2005, which is not 2004, 2003. And what
Now that comes as no surprise to you.
No surprise.
Of course.
But
But it does others.
Yes,
perhaps.
it does. The rhetoric is still Bush lied, thousands died. But what's happening in Iraq, it's one massive training exercise. So if you go to a hospital at Balad, the doctors, the nurses are Iraqis side by side, the Americans. If you see the convoys, then you see Iraqi, American side by side. If you go to Taji, you see an Iraqi division being formed with American advisors. And so the idea is that, I guess to use that now discredited word, Vietnamization, it's Iraqiization. They're trying to teach people to take over responsibility. And whether it's that security is going to allow the government to form, or the government must form to allow there to be security, people are unsure of. But the military, at least, can't worry about that. They're trying to train an Iraqi security force and a civil society that will give breathing space for the politicians to form this government.
Can they do it?
I think they can do it. I think that we did not see an all-out civil war after the explosions at the Great Dome in Samarra. But I think it's not going to be birthed in 2006. I think it'll go on to 2007. I think that within 24 months, if we stay the course, a contingent of 50 to 60,000 Americans can continue to train, and more importantly, provide the psychological support that we see in Korea today, or Japan today, or Germany today, or the Balkans today, or Panama today. One of the things that's strange, or Afghanistan today, we're all over the world. We usually have to do that.
So the war is going to be over in 2007, 2008?
Not over.
Oh.
I think that the American role will be, within a year or 2 years, will be entirely one of training and air power. I don't think you'll see American soldiers going out on patrols and taking an active part fighting and killing Iraqis. I think the idea is, militarily, we will have trained 500,000 people who can do that in service to an elected government. And then politically, it is that our presence is so ambiguous now that we're better served by staying in bases and supplying the know-how. And then politically at home, I think that people realize that there's a finite limit to a war that can be conducted with 40% public opinion. My own view is, I think that if the administration would explain this and try to say, once again, we did not get oil, the price skyrocketed after we went in. We did not install a Shah. This is not an imperial proconsulate that we're trying to craft. It's the biggest foreign aid program since the Marshall Plan to a particular targeted area. It's very idealistic. It may be naive, it may be foolish, but it's not real politique. That they could win adherents and tap into the American character and traditions of magnanimity. But that moral argument has not been sufficiently aired, I think.
Now, when this is over, is Francis Fukuyama going to be able to write another book about the end of history?
No.
Or are we going to go on to, or are we going to go on to another war?
Well, I don't know
Or
if
more history.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to go on the war, but somebody, until the end of history happens, and that's not going to happen until we're all on the other side of the river, so to speak, until the end of things. It doesn't have to be that depressing, though, because history can also be optimistic. We know what stops wars. What stops wars are military deterrence, and more importantly, it's very, I shouldn't say non-existent, but democratically elected governments are less likely to attack other democratic elected. They attack everybody else, but less likely to get, and we're living in an age where there's more democracies now than the history of the planet. So in theory, if these democracies would not fight with one another and they would practice hard-headed deterrence against the non-democratic states, then perhaps we could be in a series of 200 years, 300 years, I
So
don't
a
know.
perfect Westphalian situation, once
Yes.
again, reestablished.
Yeah.
You write in your book, and I want to pick up on this because you raised two themes. One is how well the military is doing and how it's adapting, and I want to talk about that first. You wrote, and I believe I took this down correctly, you taught Westerners, the Peloponnesian War, that the logic of military efficiency should trump tribalism, tradition, and arbitrary constructs of wealth and power.
Yeah.
And I want to apply that today. In other words, we know that we have the best and finest military, and that answers the question about military victory. But what are your thoughts after having been in Iraq about what it tells us about how we can help a people transcend tribalism, tradition,
Yes.
and so on? Because that seems to be a problem here.
Yes, what we're trying to do is tell the Muslim world in the Middle East that your fascination that you chose on your own to turn on the computer, and the internet's everywhere in Iraq, to put in a DVD, to put a satellite dish, is parasitic on Western culture. You like the pizzazz, you like the technology, you like the cell phone, but as yet you can't create or fabricate or improve or even fix a lot of that stuff. So you have a fascination for the wealth, the capital, and the modernity of the West, but that's going to collide with your traditional belief systems, your autocratic political systems, your notion of patriarchy, whatever, all of these other problems. So what we're suggesting to you is, here is another realm of the Western world that you really don't get much of, because we have been culpable in the past of supporting dictatorships or authoritarians. So we're going to give you the choice that if you want to, you can create an open society, you can remain Muslim, well, that's your business, but at least you have the opportunity, a third choice, that's not just Saddam Hussein or the Taliban or the Muslim Brotherhood or Mubarak. And out of that complex system of freedom, tolerance, religious tolerance, the equality of women if you like, then all of these other things will be changed, adopted, rejected on your own terms. But the system we have now is parasitic. Everybody in the Arab world, it seems to me, is living in an autocratic society that's failing by any measure of international commerce or economic barometers. And then these dictators make this devil's bargain with Islamicists and fundamentalists who say, you can say whatever you want about the West, but not about us. They in turn say, it's because we're not pure, we're not back in the 8th century, and all of this stuff is corrupting you. And the person who's the recipient of all of this, the so-called mythical Arab street, almost hates the very desire for things Western, that only increase the guilt, that they either can't make it or it's against Islam. So it's a very hard thing to do, but I think it's ultimately the only thing that is the solution, is to offer people the other side of Western civilization that's liberal and humane and tolerant.
To do that, does the military have to do more of what Barnett calls system administration, or previously to the Bush administration it was called nation building? In other words, the military is doing that, and is that a piece of the program that they have to have to move from one world that you're talking about to the other?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll give you an example of one or two situations. If you're in Iraq, if you go to Balad or you go to the Baghdad hospital, most of the people brought into an American-run hospital are Iraqis. But what's fascinating is the people who are letting off the IEDs and the suicide bombs are there too. So the Americans say they are entitled to a Hippocratic notion of medicine. Bring them in. Even though they try to kill us and you, we will treat them maybe under guard, and we will show you how medicine in the Western sense works. And I know that that may be naive with the Sermon on the Mount, but that's an example. Or if you're an American colonel and you're trying to train the new Iraqi 10th Division and you're trying to talk about discipline and chain of command, you also say that even though you have body armor, up-armored Humvees, you have your own budget, you cannot, under any circumstances, challenge the authority of the civilian government. You are subject to them. You can complain, but there's a chain of command that ultimately stops with civilians. They control you. Mm-hmm. So what the Americans are doing at every single level is trying to imbue a very traditional tribal society with what we would call the modern Western world, whether it's medicine or civilian military affairs. And I could magnify those examples, but that's what you're talking about, and the answer is yes.
Yeah, and what it would seem that part of this, there has to be not the military power / military victory, but the security element, I guess, the policing function that needs to be implemented and taught to the people who are, whose country it is, basically. Is this something that our military should do in this transitional phase, or is it better to bring in, police from the United States?
Well, they're doing that. We are bringing in police from the United States. We're bringing people through the National Guard that have police experience. We have military police. But it's, again, a multifaceted effort. The military thinks the most incorrigible, diehard terrorists have to be killed or exiled. We can help you do that, and we will. But when they go into a multi-level apartment that somebody else owns, and we put a GPS bomb and blow them up, we have to calibrate, is it better to get rid of the 8 people, or is it better not to destroy somebody's property who's not sympathetic to them? And those decisions are being made hourly in Iraq. And then I think the idea is that it's circular. We kill the jihadists and train the security forces. Then that gives a breathing period for the third elected system of officials to form an executive branch. When they form an executive branch of national reconciliation, then they take the wind out of the sails of the insurgency, and then it makes it easier even more, and it's holistic. And I didn't meet any military officer, and I met General Casey, General Dempsey, General Corelli, that thought that there was simply a political or military solution. It was symbiotic. Mm-hmm. Symbiotic.
Now, how does the military maintain control to achieve these goals in a context of the kind of asymmetric war that's being fought? Because what I'm hearing from you is really the good things that we can do as American and are doing, but clearly, we probably don't see enough of that in the press here, and also, one device that goes off on a road and leads to all this carnage. So what is that game like, and how can it be managed by the military?
It's very difficult. Your word asymmetrical works in so many ways. If you blow up an American vehicle, it may be that right before that happened, a helicopter gunship, American Marines have killed 20 or 30 jihadists. But in this asymmetrical narrative, somebody with a $250,000 bachelor's degree from West Point, from a wealthy suburb, if he's killed in that IED device, it doesn't matter if you've killed 40, because in that way of thinking, the Iraqis think poverty is endemic, death and tragedy is an everyday occurrence in a way it's not for an American. So the Americans realize that they have to, attack the enemy, but they can't lose anybody in the process. There's a finite number of people after which the American public will not tolerate that. That's asymmetrical. The second thing is that if somebody is riding in a tank, an Abrams tank, and a Humvee, and they see a carcass that looks like a dead dog, and it's stuffed full of explosive devices, and there's a wire going through there, and there's an 8-year-old boy who's been paid or threatened to push that button as you go by. You can't touch that boy, even though he's going to kill you. You probably can't touch his family because they're going to say they were forced to do it. You're going to find nobody that's culpable for that. But it's, how do you fight that? Well, the only way you fight that is you create a political, economic, social environment where people think that they have more to lose by pushing that button and a lot more to gain not to do it. And that requires almost daily sensitivity to Islam, Iraqi culture, Arabic language, public opinion back home, the European Court at The Hague, the EU, Amnesty International, the Red Cross. It's a multi-faceted group of forces that the American military have to deal with. The old days, we would have gone in and, like Sherman or Caesar, killed so many of the enemy, and that's the law of war, and humiliated and defeated the insurrectionists so badly that nobody would have dared think of something. But you know, we look back at Japan and Germany or Italy as examples of Reconstruction, but we forget the other side of the equation. They're exemplars of Reconstruction, partly because the enemy knew they were defeated. The enemy knew they were defeated because the American people were willing to inflict that amount of punishment and suffering and death on them. My query, and I don't have the answer, is are those laws, as you've asked, are those sort of the laws of human nature, that whether we like it or not, the Iraqis and us both understand in our dark hearts that they exist, and that Iraqi won't push that button and blow up a Humvee if he's scared to death if an American will blow up his house. And we are not operating on that premise. And this is what's very strange about this post-Enlightenment, postmodern war. We'll see if we get an exemption from these age-old primordial rules. I'm not sure we are.
But you've introduced here an element also of real time.
Yeah.
Because if we're going to wait 3 years for the young man to grow up to make the decision that he's not going to push the button because of all the advantages, we don't have that kind of time to wait. No. Do we?
We don't have that time. When I was in Iraq, it was the clear understanding from almost every military officer with responsibility beyond his own men who had some political sense. Back from Washington, there was a clock ticking,
all right,
and that clock ticking was the daily media account of the losses and costs to Americans. And it was going to end very soon, and they were in a frenzied, I can't underestimate that, frenzied rush to train before their mandate. Whether, you know, everybody talks about Iraq, securing the Middle East, bringing democracy, war against terror, but one element that we don't talk about is the pride and the feeling of success of the American military.
Here, here.
American military believes that if they go into Iraq and they take Saddam out in 3 weeks and they establish a democratic alternative, they've been successful. If they come home early and Iraq ends like Lebanon, they feel that people will ultimately blame them, and it will have the same injurious effect as Vietnam. And they're constantly talking about it.
And they're right.
I think they're right.
Mm-hmm. Now, but we're getting at a core problem here, which is we have the best military. We have a military that can adapt, but it is the military of a democracy. So and in that democracy is this cacophony of voices and a press which will print all sorts of things and so on. So patriotism is a low value, unfortunately.
Yes.
You know, at home. So what does that mean? Because you're a person who understands the Western tradition and what
Yes.
the Greeks, for example, have get. So how do we put those two things together? The military role that we may have to promote on the one hand, but then embedded in a democracy with all of its failings.
Well, I think I go back to the historian Thucydides because he watched Aristophanes' plays and Euripides' Trojan Women, and he understood the anti-war movement in Athens. And he said that at very key periods in that war, whether it was the Athenian disaster at Sicily or it was the Athenian resurgence in the Aegean, that democracies, when pressed and when their existence is threatened, have all of these advantages of tapping into the imagination, the experiences of everybody in society, and they do very well. World War II, World War I, the Union Army and the Civil War. However, when the democratic citizenry doesn't feel that it's engaged, is not put upon to contribute, then the things that you outlined, this natural hyper-individualism, this hyper-criticism, this hyper-cynicism, they all play. And how does that work out? It works out of wars of existential survival. Democracies do very well. In long-term political wars that are not defined as essential to they don't do that well. And we see that whether it's the French in Algeria or us in Vietnam. And so that being said, we can win this war if the American people believe that losing Iraq or losing to a war to Islamic fascists will eventually create something worse than 9/11. So far, that hasn't been communicated in a way that's necessary, in my view.
And why is that? I mean, what should have been done that wasn't done, do you think?
Well, I happen to, and this is a minority eccentric view, I think we should have had a declaration of war against the Taliban and a declaration of war against Saddam, and then a lot of things happened. There's the whole problem with Guantanamo is no longer an issue because you're a POW in a war. You've declared a war. Nobody in World War II was saying these poor Germans in Iowa or Mississippi haven't had a trial yet. They're detained indefinitely. Then you also have certain ideas that if you're in a war, then somebody doesn't go over to Iraq and broadcast about the United States, or somebody doesn't call the commander-in-chief the world's greatest terrorist, just like Lincoln would not put up with that, FDR would not put up. That's one thing that we could have done, and most importantly, it would have sent the message that this is a war, and that would have been very valuable. Instead, we said go out and shop, keep the economy going.
So in a way, taxes too. Maybe we should
Absolutely.
raise taxes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I could see going into deficit spending, and I could see borrowing money if that was for munitions and manpower. But when you're doing that tax to just simply stimulate the economy when it's already been stimulated by war, then that message did not denote a sense of urgency or national purpose and survival.
I believe that I get the impression, and this is my second interview with you, that you really feel that when you're engaged in a war like this, you really have to go for victory, basically. And all of what you just said would follow from that this is important, this is a clash of values or of civilizations or way of life, and you have to make that commitment, and you have to tell the people in democracy this is what it's about.
We need to tell people in a liberal democracy, whatever your view on women, there's a consensus that women should be equal. They don't believe it. We tolerate we encourage the rights of minorities. Homosexuals, for example, they don't believe it. We don't believe in gender apartheid. They don't believe it. We tolerate different religions. We encourage Buddhist and Muslim. They don't. We don't believe in Sharia law. They do. There's a fault line here that's very important. And when they came over on September 11th and tried to project those values of the 9th, 8th century upon us, then that was a war. And I think it's very important when you go to war, you have these parameters, and you say that we're in a war now. There are going to be monumental errors and lapses, just like the Sherman tank should have been better designed, just like the hedgerow fighting after D-Day should have been better planned, just like there was intelligence failures completely about the Battle of the Bulge. But within those parameters, they're not fatal to the war effort, and we're going to win. So in my own case, I wasn't one of these people who, during the Clinton administration, the Project for a New American Century, remake the Middle East through democracy, preempt, take out Saddam. But once 9/11 happened, and you saw that nexus between authoritarianism and terrorism and autocratic fundamentalism, didn't matter to me whether it was secular in the case of Saddam or religious in the case of Taliban. That'd be like saying that the Nazis could never work with the Japanese because they're racist and the Japanese are not so-called Caucasian. They were fascist, and we didn't really worry about who was more fascist or what vein Mussolini and Tojo and Hitler were. Now, when you go to war, then you should keep that in mind, that unless there's egregious mistakes, that we can win the war if we have national resolve, unity of purpose, and we have not been able to achieve that here. So one of the traditional ways of calling off the Western military juggernaut is always either to redefine losses in terms of your one soldier from the suburbs is much worse for you than 1,000 of our kids from the slums of Baghdad, or to get other Western powers to call off, the French fleet, the French at Toulon before Lepanto, the Turkish fleet was there. So only 3 states fought at Lepanto. So if you can get France or you can get Germany to call off the United States, that's one way of doing it. And then the third way traditionally has been to create civic dissension, that in the Civil War, if you can have riots to call off the Army of the Potomac, or in World War II, if you can have a strike or something. And here in this war, the jihadists know, if you look at their fatwas, they're right out of the anti-war argument. In fact, sometimes they even quote by this book, and they mention the title of a very anti-war book published in the United States. So,
before we leave this, though, one book of yours that struck me enormously was the book The Soul of Battle. And there you speak of how a democracy, or at least a society, a polity, and a culture that has a sure sense of its values and the importance of this can, under very difficult circumstances, enormously field that kind of a military force that has a moral dynamic that goes and carries all before it.
I think so, and I tried to privilege the role of the commander, somebody like William Tecumseh Sherman, who really didn't kill very many people, but he imbued the Army of the West with an idea that they started the war, and we are yeomen from the North, and we're going to prove that we are not industrial tinkers like they blasphemous, that we are better soldiers. We're going to go into the heart of the Confederacy and rip that thing apart and show them the wages of their aggression. Same thing with George Patton. We are not supermen in the Aryan sense, but we are far superior as democratic people, and we're going to go across France like you won't believe in 60 days. Or in case of the ancient general that I mentioned, Epaminondas, we can do more in 1 year than the Athenians can in 27 because we're moving and we're going to destroy Sparta. So missing in this war is some commander who would say, this war is for liberal values, and I've got a bunch of soldiers over here, I've got a bunch of women over here, I've got a bunch of people from different races, minorities, and they represent the future of a liberal West that's being attacked by these people, and they're not going to lose. We are going to destroy these jihadists, and if they keep it up, they're going to regret the day they did it.
But isn't George Bush that general, although he is not by definition in command in the same sense in which any of the three others
At particular moments, at particular places, he absolutely is. That wonderful speech he gave with the bullhorn on the rubble of 9/11 at the site of the former World Trade Center, when he said, the whole world is going to hear about this from you very soon. But when he says that we have to go out and spend money to improve the economy, or we change infinite justice to enduring freedom because somebody complains about the nomenclature is insensitive to the jihadist, or
and we can't use crusade.
Exactly, can't use the word crusade. Or Colin Powell goes over to Pakistan and talks in the middle of the Afghan war about a coalition government, including perhaps Taliban. Then all of these weaken that sense of purpose and confidence that we can win. We don't have a lot of people who say, we are going to defeat the enemy utterly, and they're going to regret that they tried to destroy Western civilization. Nobody, if you said that in this campus, people would think you needed medical help.
You know, you write in the book, you say some things that seem to be relevant to this discussion, and I'm paraphrasing here. These are not your exact. You want in the section on your conclusions, democracies don't give generals leeway. You're talking about the Peloponnesian War, and then you're talking about the democracy changes their goals and are not satisfied, and this became part of Athens' problem. So what I'm hearing in this discussion in the way is that a military man who was elected, who presumably doesn't seize power, who has a feel for battle and the requirements of battle, and also has a sense of what America's mission has to be in this world of rogue states, that is an alternative out there that we don't have now. And when you have democratically elected presidents who don't have this military service, they don't quite make it.
Yeah.
I'm overstating everything, but that's what I'm hearing you say.
Well, they don't have to have necessarily military experience, but they have to have a confidence on what the military is and what it is for. And all wars are expansionary. I don't think anybody who saw December 7th ever thought we were going to end up all the way into Czechoslovakia with the Third Army. Just by the same token, Mr. Lincoln said that we were going to war to preserve the Union. He did not write the Emancipation Proclamation until the 1st of January in 1863. That was a whole new wrinkle to that war. So Mr. Bush said that he was going to punish the Taliban. Then some people say, well, expanded the war. Well, every war does once you get in it and you start to see the relationships why a man like Mr. Zakari would flee immediately to Baghdad, or why the Kurdish separatists that are killing our friendly Kurds have al-Qaeda there, or why you get there and you find out that everybody from Abu Nadal to Abu Abbas is there. So these wars are expansionary, and you know, really, quite frankly, Shia fanaticism in Iran that may become nuclear is not the same enemy as the Taliban. It's not the same enemy as Saddam Hussein. It's not the same enemy as Zakari. But if you think that there's not parallels and commonalities that share an anti-Western agenda, then if you don't think that, you're very naive.
So is what we're witnessing in the Middle East, putting our presence aside, is there a civil war in the Middle East? Is that what adds to the complexity with all of these different groups at each other and so on?
There's a war against modernism. That's what this war is
but
about.
But also a war within, right?
Within the people in the Middle East
who are modern
either,
or not.
yes, absolutely,
okay,
are either Western educated, or they follow Western rules of jurisprudence, commerce, business practices, or they dress Western, or women who want to be treated equally. Those people have put their lot in with the West. They're not the majority. And so the forces of reactionism want to bring back this world and promulgate this idea that we are secondary. We do not have status, pride, and honor because we are not pure enough. And like all good reactionaries, whether they're Nazis or Japanese militarists, they always appeal to a solidified, pure past where everybody was the same religion. There was no recalcitrant people, blasphemers. And this is going to cure our present weakness. It's not going to be science, university, liberalism, emulating this decadent West. That's what the war is about. And it doesn't really matter whether they're Iranians or Jordanians or Iraqis or Taliban Afghans. And it doesn't mean that we're against the people. See, suddenly in 1939, you can't find, 1941, you can't find anybody in Europe who's not a declared Nazi. French, Turkish, Spaniard, they all think Hitler's great right before he invades Russia. 1946, you can't find anybody who's ever for Hitler. Just like in 1946, everybody's for Stalin. 2003, you can't find a Stalinist very often in Europe, and it's because these belief systems have to be defeated, humiliated, discredited, and bring injury to the people who embrace them. Then the majority will cast them off. Once you destroy and isolate and humiliate Islamic fascism, nobody will want anything to do with it, just as we see in Afghanistan. Most people do not, the polls all suggest, do not want to bring the Taliban back.
So this war isn't going to be over when we leave the troops out of Iraq. We get the troops
It's
out.
more, there's going to be there's going to be theaters, but this war is not going to be over until somebody who stands up in the Middle East and says, I want to destroy the West, I want to blow up another trade center, until somebody said, don't say that. Stop that. We're not going to put up with that.
And you can do that without a Hiroshima or an invasion and destruction of Berlin?
We don't know.
You
We
can't.
don't know. What we at least know is this, that we have told the Islamic fascists that we are willing to isolate and attack you and at the same time offer an alternative between you and dictatorship for the majority of people. Now, this is what we're willing to do. However, if you insist on, I mean, we're starting to see an escalation with Madrid, London, French rioting, Danish cartoons, fatwas here, fatwas there. If they continue to escalate, I don't think they understand there will be a requisite Western escalation. And we're already seeing that in Europe. And I think that, historically speaking, the Middle East should take a deep breath and say, we are 1 billion people in a planet of 6 billion. And what we know from the history of the civilization on this planet is Western civilization is absolutely lethal when it's pushed to the edge, and we do not want to go there.
Carnage and culture.
Yeah, they need to say that.
All right.
Yeah. Now let's draw on your work as a historian and a classicist to ask, how do you think this will play out, and what do we need to make it play out, in the right way? Clearly, you have a military that can adapt, with the right resources that can win. But do you feel that the way we handle this next stage in Iraq will determine and have very great implications for what happens in this war that you're describing?
Absolutely. There's literally tens of millions of people who are modern. We saw that of the people who wanted to demonstrate in Jordan against Zakaria. There's people in the Gulf. If you go to Kuwait City, there's people who have made that decision. They're watching Iraq and they're saying, are the forces of modernism going to be here to give us support and aid and encouragement? If we leave, then the neighborhood Islamicist who wants to chop up somebody's hand off or behead somebody he doesn't like is going to be the new authority figure we have to deal with. By the same token, we're worried about Iran being subversive to Iraq, but the Iranians, we must remember, are worried about us because the Iraq experiment can be very subversive to Iranian theocracy. If they have a full-blown democracy, you have a democracy in Iraq, you have a democracy in Afghanistan, you've got liberalization in Lebanon and Kuwait and Israel, and suddenly the world doesn't look so good for Islamic fascism in Iran. So this war is for all the stakes. It really is.
Now, it would seem that we're in a stage where we're sitting here in the spring of 2006 where the consensus, whatever it might have been for the war, is really falling apart. And as someone who writes for the National Review, I would like to read from a recent column by Buckley where he says, "One can't doubt that the American objective in Iraq has failed." Would you comment on what I guess Lyndon Johnson used to call the nervous Nellies, which are really also appearing, you know, on the right of center flank?
Yes. I think I've said that I have a great deal of respect, in a sense, for the people who contribute to The Nation magazine on the hard left and the hard right paleo-conservatives, say the Buchanan New American Conservative magazine. Now, in between, we've seen, I think it was over 70 senators and a majority of Democratic senators vote to go and take out Saddam. Most of the Democrats have bailed, some of the Republicans. They say it was because of WMD, but in fact that was one of 23 pretexts. What it really is the American people, when the statue fell, 70% of them liked that 3-week war. But they don't like the 3-year quote-unquote peace, so they say it was WMD. My perfect war, your screwed up peace is the answer. And so in the conservative camp, that has started to infect them. So a lot of people who may not have been neoconservative architects of democratic revolution, but the George Wills, the William F. Buckleys, the Neil Fergusons, the Francis Fukuyama, there's a whole spectrum. I don't want to just with a brush say they're all the same about their degrees of support, but more or less you can go back to every single one of them during that 3-week war and you can find support for it for various reasons. That has disappeared. That's disappeared when the polls went from 70 to 40 and the American casualties went from 176 to over 2,200. And my only reply to them is that, one, given the magnitude of the undertaking and the amount at stake compared to Korea, Vietnam, World War II, World I, Civil War, we are doing very well. And two, whether you like it or not, your opposition for something you once supported lends a lot of weight to people who may have a different agenda than you do. And three, it seems to me that when you say you're for a war and you send people over there and they're over there and you're back here, what is the 130,000 Americans who still believe, if you talk to a lot of them, that this is going to work? What are they going to do when the conservatives who supported them now think that it was a mess? So if you say, I don't think it can work, it's over, well, what's the large logical corollary of that if you're in Kirkuk or Taji? You're sitting there and you think, Mr. Buckley's smart, far brighter and better educated than I am, says it can't work. Well, why am I here tomorrow then? Let me just go home now. And I really don't know whether Mr. Buckley or the other conservatives would really think that would be salutary to just simply leave and say, you know what, we got close with 3 elections. We got close with killing a lot of jihadists. We got close with training, but not close enough.
What do you think will be the effect of all of this on the military, on our military? Will they adapt or does that depend on the final
Yes,
chapter?
yes.
I
Well,
mean,
they
is
are
that
adapting now
Yeah.
as we speak, and
Yeah.
they're adapting in the sense that whether they would admit it or not, they are much more sensitive to casualties. They don't want as many Americans to go out. They want to train more Iraqis. And the $64,000 question that they cannot answer is this transparent to the jihadists? Do they know the restraints upon us, and are we emboldening them? But as long as George Bush gets up in the morning and says, this is important for Iraq, it's important for the United States, as long as Donald Rumsfeld is not like Robert McNamara, as long as the Joint Chiefs and the people in Iraq believe in it, as long as the soldiers do, they have a window, even at 40% public approval, because the polls are volatile. Give me an example. I'll give you a final example. If Saddam is tried and found guilty and executed in a legal manner of normal jurisprudence in the next 6 months, if Zakari is captured, if Osama bin Laden is captured, if there's a government formed, if Americans are not being killed each week, all of this very quickly could turn into a Balkan situation where the American public is, as I understand it, basically given a blank check for peacekeeping in the Balkans for the last 8 years.
One final question. If you were thinking about writing a book about this period, the Middle East wars, let's call it, what sort of framing would you be thinking about doing? In other words, what will be the big questions about, I'm not asking you to tell me how it's going to end,
Yes.
but really about the big questions that were decisive in these campaigns?
I would say that is Western civilization as defined by Europe and the United States at its level, greatest level of sophistication, education, affluence, and leisure, is it capable of maintaining a unity of purpose to defeat people entirely antithetical and willing to do things that we wouldn't even imagine to do to destroy us? Do we still have the ability to do that without quitting, or without giving up, or without surrendering, or without self-imploding with mutual recrimination? That's what's at stake.
Victor, on that note, until that book comes out, I'm going to recommend to our audience that they go out and buy your new book, A War Like No Other. And I want to thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Professor Barnes, for joining us.
Thank you, Victor, very
And
much.
thank you very much
Great.
for joining us for this conversation with history.